Pedestrian. About 20 years ago, I lost a woman I was dating to suicide. She jumped from the window of the hospital where she was hospitalized for her injuries. The road beside the hospital was a steep downhill, and the road was separated from the building by a 30 centimeters thick concrete base. 2 weeks earlier, she had been hospitalized after she fell somehow in her living room, fell headfirst onto a glass table, and suffered a severe cut on her face. Her cheek was roughly cut by shards of glass, and her lower lip was crumpled and dangling beyond original shape. Her life was not in serious condition, but the psychological damage she had suffered was so severe that I had to take a paid leave to attend to her. After several plastic surgeries, her condition had stabilized and she had regained her composure after 2 weeks. I left her in the hospital room, where the medication had put her into a deep sleep, and went home to get a change of clothes for her. It was around 2300 hours. As I returned to the hospital with her belongings, I saw several police cars with flashing red lights. As it is quite common for the police to ask the victim what happened in order to process an accident, I took the elevator without much concern and headed for her hospital room. As I got off the elevator, I noticed that the hallway was rather noisy. Several night shift nurses were running around, and a plainclothes police officer was in front of the nurses' center asking the nurses what was going on. Several heads of hospitalized patients peeked out of the doors of their rooms. The nurse, who was being questioned by the police officer, noticed me and suddenly changed her expression. The police officer, not missing the nurse's expression, immediately rushed to me and grabbed my arm. Accompanied by the police officer and the nurse, I entered the nurse's center. As I did so, I noticed a pair of slippers left at the end of the hallway. During the interview with the nurse, I learned that she had jumped from the hallway window and died almost instantly. I had told the nurses that I was coming back to get my things, so I was not under any suspicion, but they did ask me about her condition just prior to the incident. She was not a weak person, and she was recovering from the emotional damage done by the facial injury. Still, I answered that she might have been bothered by it. I had no choice but to answer that. It was obvious to me that I should not have said that shallow thought that crossed my mind at that moment. She had been terribly frightened since the incident. The more she tried to act tough, the more the fear inside her came back, and at work she made many mistakes and even talked about resigning from her job. All I could do was to be there for her and talk to her, but at the same time, I felt that my being there for her was making her more scared. I was left with what looked like a reddish-purple bruise on my right arm, which she stared at hatefully and at one point even attempted to stick a pair of scissors at me. Her injury was an accident that occurred while she was in such a precarious state. About a month before she was injured at home, a mishap befell her and me. It made her and I feel like fugitives, and we became very concerned about the way people looked at us. I was nervous about the people I met on my way to work, and I feared the shadows of telegraph poles and street signs. The bruise on my right arm would not go away, no matter how much I denied it in my head. There were times when we cried together in baseless fear of the worst possible outcome. My girlfriend and I chose an amusement park as the destination for our first long-distance ride in the new car she had just purchased. Since it was quite far away, we initially considered staying overnight, but since we had an important errand to run the next day, we decided to push ourselves and return home that day. I was not as tired as I had expected, and I hurried homeward, taking turns driving several times along the way. It was after 10 p.m., and the highway was surprisingly empty. At the time, I did not have an onboard navigation system and did not carry a road map because once I got off the highway, I did not have to worry about getting lost on the way to my home. On the way, we got off the highway to get some food and drinks. We wanted to eat somewhere, but we could not find a good place to eat, so we had no choice but to buy some bread and drinks at a convenience store and get back on the highway again. We both felt a sense of discomfort immediately afterwards. She, in the passenger seat, would occasionally glance anxiously out the window and look around as if searching for something. I felt a strange stirring in my chest as I looked for a sign that indicated where we were going. Did I take a wrong turn? Driving along the monotonous highway, it didn't take me long to notice something more unusual. There was not a single car heading in the same direction as us, nor were there any lights of oncoming cars visible through the median strip. From the direction of the road, it would not have been surprising to see the lights of the town where the convenience store we had just stopped at was located over the oncoming lane, but we could see nothing beyond the guardrail that seemed to cut through the darkness. The orange exterior lights on the side of the road illuminate the street as if it were daylight, bright enough to read a book. There was no way I could have mistaken it. It was a pedestrian. She was wearing a light bluish striped one-piece dress and was walking along the shoulder of the road in the same direction as us. Her black hair, which reached to the middle of her back, was slightly fluttering. Naturally, she noticed. We looked at each other, then searched for an answer. There was someone, wasn't there? Her voice sounded as if it was trembling. All I could do was nod, and with a glare at the front of the car, I pressed down on the gas pedal even harder. It never occurred to me to stop the car. Perhaps it was the uncomfortable feeling I had been having all along. I remember going through a couple of tunnels. But by that time, we had no idea where we were going. There were no signs indicating where we were going. The thin line on the road stretched endlessly, disappearing into the darkness far, far away. She was the first to notice. She pressed her back against the seat noisily and pointed forward with a voice that almost sounded like an inaudible scream. I recognized her immediately. A pedestrian, dressed in the same manner as before, was walking on the shoulder of the road a few dozen meters ahead. I shifted my car to the lane closer to the center line and passed the pedestrian without slowing down. I could see she was shaking. "What do you mean?" "I don't know." I turned up the volume on my car stereo and drove on in search of an interchange, trying to shake off the bad feeling that threatened to engulf us both. We had just passed through several tunnels again. As usual, there was not a single car in sight except for us. Neither of us could speak. What we saw in the orange glow of the exterior lights didn't seem real. The pedestrian was on the street. He was walking almost in the middle of the left lane. I was well aware of the danger of driving by them at high speed as it was, but I knew that slowing down or stopping would involve even more danger. Though I was not wrong in my judgment, I could not predict the pedestrian's movement. The pedestrian suddenly collapsed. It was as if his legs were pinned, a noose was tied around his neck, and he was pulled down with great force. Our car bounced wildly over the pedestrian's body, and we could hear the eerie sound of the car's body beneath us. I must confess that I only slammed on the brakes after the car had passed over the pedestrian's body. The car slid and veered into the left lane and came to a stop facing slightly to the right. As most people would do, I turned around quickly. She, too, twisted her upper body to look in the direction we had just run. Once again, I must be honest, but I will not deny that we both let out a sigh of relief for a brief moment at this point. The prone body of the pedestrian we had expected to see was nowhere to be found. I took a deep breath and then got out of the car. I walked to the area where I thought I had hit the pedestrian. There was no trace of the pedestrian on the street illuminated by an exterior light. Of course, there were no stains on the pedestrian's body or blood. I thought for a moment and turned back to my car. She looked at me anxiously. She threw me a frightened look as she tightened her sides and hugged her arms. I looked at her as I walked around the side of the car and peeked under the body from the front. Nothing. Not a scratch on the bumper, body, or headlight lenses. I also inspected the front left wheel, which I assumed had hit the pedestrian. And then the rear wheel. I went back to the front and looked under the car again. Again, nothing. I crouched down in front of the car, illuminated by the headlights, and thought for a moment. I considered all possibilities and came to no conclusion. I suddenly looked up at the roof of the car and saw nothing like I had imagined. I stood up, unable to think straight, and looked at her in the car. Her face was pale and I could see her lips trembling slightly. I shook my head as if nothing was wrong, then put my hands on the hood and tried to smile to relieve her fears. Her face froze. I could see her sitting in the passenger seat, but she could see something else besides me. I realized someone was standing behind me. Please consider that what follows is based on her story as she later told it to me and possibly my imagination. When she committed suicide, there is a good reason why I told the police officer that she was not a weak person. If either her decision or her courageous action had been lacking at that time, I might not be here writing this. From an early age, I have always been terribly afraid of spiritual beings and deformed things, and have spent many a sleepless night borrowing such stories from the library. When I was 9 years old, I read an introduction to a vampire who sucked blood from the limbs, and even in the middle of summer, I would sleep under the covers from head to toe. I love sports, I got good grades in school, and even at my age, I still have more confidence than most people, but I can never shake off my fear of certain entities. The fear I felt all over my body at that time was exactly that kind of fear. Human behavior in a tight situation can defy even the best expectations and, in retrospect, make one wonder if it was even true. It is therefore a matter of doubt and imagination. Even now, I wonder about the way her face froze as she sat in the passenger seat, as if I was watching a slow-motion video of the mysteries of nature. I even found it beautiful. Immediately, I was seized with a huge sense of resignation and despair. Oh dear. There is nothing I can do. Believe it or not, it's true. I felt my whole body bubble up and I turned around. The pedestrian in the light blue striped one-piece dress we had seen so many times on this highway, the woman I had just supposedly crushed with a 1-ton piece of steel, was standing right in front of me. The woman's movement and my reaction were almost simultaneous. The woman's face was ripped open from around the mouth and the upper half of her face fell backward. The entire surface was bright red, and something like a tongue was wriggling in it. I quickly crossed my arms in front of my face and closed my eyes tightly. I felt a fresh breath on both arms. A cool, rough feeling crawled up my right arm. Then I heard her scream. I got into the car as she pulled me along, and she drove me home. I could not find a single sign, but there were several signs in the usual places, as usual, and I did not get lost. As she drove, her profile became bloodless, and her arms continued to tremble as she gripped the steering wheel. I heard her cry out, "Come on." I heard her cry was, "Come on." When I crossed my arms and braced myself, she had already jumped out of the car and was rushing to my side. I didn't have the slightest idea that I had to run away, so I just did as she asked and pushed her into the passenger seat, watching idly as she climbed into the driver's seat. According to her story, she backed the car up about 30 meters, then stepped on the gas and drove by the woman. She said the woman held out her arms as if trying to grab something and came at the car as it drove by. However, she said that after she drove past, she did not see the woman in her rearview mirror. After we got home, she was the first one to notice the bruise on my arm. It was a reddish-purple bruise about 5 by 3 centimeters, and as far as I could remember I had never had such a bruise on my arm until that time. At the same time, I vividly remembered that something had touched me right around the bruise during the previous incident. I thought the bruise was a lick mark from something like a tongue that I saw when the woman's face opened. She clearly remembered how the woman had pressed her face close to mine, and she thought I was going to be bitten. She was terribly concerned about the hideous bruise on my arm until the day she died. Sometimes, when we were eating together or reading a book together in the living room, I would notice her staring at my arm. From the next day on, we pored over the TV news and newspapers. If we had really caused personal injury, we had already escaped. More guilt than fear took over, and the next few days were a series of heated cursing and deep-sinking moments. After a week, we went to the nearest police station with the best of intentions. The highway connecting our home location to the amusement park we had visited that day was inspected from end to end. Naturally, the surrounding hospitals were also checked first. Her car was also closely examined. However, nothing was found. The highway itself, illuminated as bright as daylight by orange exterior lights, where we were supposed to have driven, was finally undetected by the police. In conclusion, we do not know how the police received our story and how they handled it. When we received the police report a few days later, we were left with nothing but unjustified fear and a bad aftertaste. Since the incident on the highway, she and I talked many times, sometimes hurting each other, but I loved her and she continued to love me. I tried to forget her as quickly as possible, and the police officers who cared for her told me the same thing. When she fell at home and hurt her face badly, we never connected the accident to the incident on the highway in our conversations. She was supposed to be getting better little by little. There is no way to know now why she had to choose to die in such a seizure without showing any signs of it. At her funeral, several police officers who had helped her during the highway search came to pay their respects, and one of them cried as if she had lost an old acquaintance out of deep sympathy. I wanted to cry as much as she did, but when I saw her in the casket, I felt fear again, and I felt a sense of remorse that I had never felt before, and I wanted to run away. That night she died, she reached out from her bed with both hands and rubbed my right arm constantly as if she were trying to remove a bruise. I told her, "Don't worry." But she only smiled and would not stop herself. Then she fell asleep, and I, being the easygoing type, left her alone in the hospital room. I don't want to know what it was that moved her. Still, I do. Perhaps her death was not the death she wanted. The lower half of her face in the coffin was covered with a white cloth, and the scar where she had been stitched from the edge of her left eye had disappeared beneath the white cloth. Her head was misshapen, and in place of her beautiful hair was an ill-fitting wig. Her left eye had been replaced by an artificial eye. His hands, stacked in front of his body, were covered with numerous scratches. They must have been caused by a fall. A mourner standing next to me placed a flower in her hand. At that moment, the flower, which was already on her body, spilled over and her right sleeve turned up just a little. I was glued to her pale right arm, unable to move until another mourner hurried me away. I rolled up my own right arm in mourning near her casket. The bruise had vanished without a trace. I still do not know the reason why such a disaster befell her and me, or where it was intended to lead her and me. I do not even know what she knew, what she realized, or how she died. But when I stand at her grave, the tears that did not spill even at her funeral still silently well up in my eyes. Each time, my wife says to me, "When you die, you must go to her." I am fine with being alone, considering the pain and suffering she went through. This concludes this story. Thank you for listening to the end.